thank you, Brad. Just as many of you know, I had some health issues last year, so I just want to thank you for your sort of warm wishes. I'm doing very well, and so I'm glad I can sort of be here and share my knowledge. With that, sort of get on to my highlights of the SMPTE second study group report on PTP security. So SMPTE's now produced 2 study reports. The first one was mostly focused on sort of identifying what the threat landscape looked like, and then there's the second report, which does a deeper dive into those threats, and then looks at some ways you can sort of mitigates those threats. And so this presentation is focused on that second report. We are sort of considering doing a third report. The newest version of IEEE, the 2.1 version, does add some stuff around security, and that may have some impact on our industry. So we may do a third report, or we may not. Okay, so what's in sort of the report in detail? So there's a section on the background, then we have this large section looking at specific threats, and then looking at how to sort of mitigate and control that. We have some recommended practices around sort of the best practices for PTP security, and there may be some sort of future work, so we sort of touch on what are some sort of future work that we may want to consider. So in the background, we look at the threat dynamics and the attacker's goals. So the attacker's goals might be sort of financial or ideological. And one thing to note about the attackers is they are becoming much more sophisticated, well-funded, well-educated, and very patient there. So what's special about media networks? So in media networks, we have lots of flows, could be like up into thousands, and they're very high bandwidth, so like 3 gigabit flows or higher. And they need to be sort of presented to the network at a very sort of reasonably precise times. We have signal processing that involves sort of synchronizing your inputs, so we want to don't have lip sync kind of issues. And we have automation systems that have to accurately play out commercials, programming, sort of with frame accuracy, and setting those controls across the network. We're using the SMPTE 2059-1 and -2. So -1 is involved with how do we distribute the time within the network, and then -2 is how do we use that time? How do we calculate top of frame and frame boundaries from that time? So when I talk about a broadcast or professional media system, what do we mean? So it's a system using the 2110 family of standards for all the different essence flows. We're using the SMPTE 2059-1 and -2 for our network genlock. Quite probably we're using 2022-7 for our seamless protection for our redundancy. We're using the JTM 1001-1, which is defining our device behavior. And then for our sort of finding the different flows and devices, we've got our AM ISO 4. And then in terms of controlling those flows, we're using ISO 5. So graphically here, we've got at the bottom here, we have what we call our media nodes. So these are things like our cameras, multi-viewers, our various essence devices. We've got, since we're using -7, we'll have sort of 2 switches. One is our blue network and one's our amber network, or some people call it a red network and blue network. And then for control, we may be using in-band control, so it'll be through the blue switch and the amber switch, or it could be out-of-band control where we have a separate network. And then logically, these all form one large network. Especially now, like in COVID time, we had sort of station engineers might want to work from home and control the network, so they have remote access going into the network, which unfortunately now adds more ways that people can attack our systems. And you may have vendors being able to sort of help debug, and then so they can also remotely log in. So again, it's very powerful, but it does add more ways to attack the network. Let's see here. From the timing system, we've got our grandmasters, which are the source of our time, quite probably connected up to some sort of GPS type system. We have our 2 switches, so we have 1 grandmaster on each network, and then at the bottom we have our media nodes. Our system is not completely air-gapped. We do want to make sure that the entire system converges to the same sense of time, so we will have some low-speed connections between the 2 switches. So it's not a true air-gap system, it's mostly, but we won't have essence going between the two. Okay, so now looking at what the attacker might be attacking. They might be attacking the data, the essence, the video and audio. They might be attacking the control and management system or the timing system directly, so our 2059 and our PTP. Well, what may they try to be doing? So they may be wanting to sort of change the time. So if you change the time, then your automation systems won't play out the commercials and the programming at the right time. You might want to try to disrupt the timing distribution. So you might want to change the frequency. So if you take the network and say take it off 1,000 ppm, which is not huge, but a lot of devices don't have that kind of lock range. So if you change the frequency by 1,000 ppm, devices will have struggle locking. They'll sort of go in and out of lock, or they might go into free run, and then not all devices support asynchronous mode, so you can cause a lot of disruption. Or they might want to be trying to stop the time distribution completely. So this is some sort of like denial of service type attack, which again, then the devices will go into free run, which not everyone maybe can handle these asynchronous streams. If we look at this from a sort of classical information theory security point of view, we've got confidentiality, which in general means that unauthorized people can't view the information. When it comes to timing, timing's not really a sensitive, knowing what time it is, that's not, people can know that, so that's sort of not a huge one to worry about. Integrity, we want to make sure that the information is complete and has not been tampered with. That is an important consideration. And then availability is also important. We want to make sure that the time is available to all the devices in a sort of a timely manner. So the next section of the report gets into each of the threats. And what we came up with is sort of trying to present the information in a consistent way. So we came up with this idea of what we call threat cards. So each threat card is laid out in a consistent way, and we go for each threat. And so on the threat cards, we have a sort of a name of what this threat is, what sort of category it is, a very quick description, what the impact is. So the 4 areas are, again, we could be changing the time, changing like the frequency, or sort of denial of service type attack. And each of those can then have an impact on the essence, which is kind of critical for our systems. Then we have a bit more detailed description of what this threat is about, and then a section that talks about what are the characteristics of your network to make this vulnerability apply to it. So depending on how you design your network, this threat may or may not apply. Ideally, you sort of designed it to minimize and control, like mitigate the problem, but realistically, we want to be able to monitor our system to sort of see if it's under attack. So we have a section here to sort of what kind of controls and statuses you want to measure to sort of see, is your system under attack? Depending on the threat, that monitoring may or may not be as effective. So we have the next box talks about how effective that monitoring is. And then the last box is basically looking at what are strategies you can use to mitigate this threat. So all the threats are basically use this same format. So looking at details, so this is one of the threat cards from the report. So it's called the rogue leader, which is dealing with tampering and spoofing. So basically with this threat here, a device wants to basically win the BMCA algorithm and become the master of, or the leader of the system, of the network. This can, if you do this, it can basically generate false times or change the frequency. Or the 2 main things. It doesn't cause a denial of service, so that doesn't really apply to this one. So in this case here now, with that threat, we've connected a device. It's trying to win the BMCA algorithm. If it is, it becomes then the time source for the network. So in terms of what are the characteristics of a network, so if you're using non-boundary clock switches and you're not using this leader-only mode, then you're sort of susceptible to this kind of attack. We'll sort of cover that more when we look at sort of the recommended practices, how to avoid this. In ways to sort of detect that this is going on, we can look at if there's been a change of grandmaster ID on the media nodes or on the switches. We could be looking at if the grandmasters, the legitimate grandmasters, go from an active state to a passive state, that indicates that some other person is the grandmaster of the network. And we can also look at the counters, like most switches will have counters for how many amounts messages have occurred, and if that rate on an interface that you're not expecting is counting, then you know something's weird there. So there's different ways you can sort of monitor, see if this is happening. Now, one thing is that, I mean, there could be a legitimate failure of one grandmaster and it fails over to the other one. So just because you see a change doesn't necessarily mean that there's a problem. It may be just an expected sort of way that the network's working. So you sort of have to be cautious of that information. But basically, if you see that neither of your grandmasters are in the active state, then that's more conclusive that something is going wrong here. In terms of ways to sort of mitigate that, if we use boundary clock mode switches, or put our switches in boundary clock mode, and then we use the leader only feature, that's sort of a very powerful way to sort of prevent this kind of attack. Another threat here is sort of bad sync messages. So again, this is sort of a tampering spoofing thing. Here what we're doing is a device is injecting additional sync messages into the network, and they've got some sort of erroneous information to sort of help confuse the devices. Again, this is primarily affecting the false time or the distribution of time. So in this case here, I mean, most messages or most sync messages are multicast, and so you've got a device, it'll generate these multicast messages, they'll go to all the devices, cause a bit of confusion. Again, by using if you're using a non-boundary clock switch, you're sort of vulnerable to this kind of attack. Ways you can sort of detect it, just sort of looking again at those counters to see, are you seeing more sync messages than you expect in your design? That sort of tells you that something is going wrong. You may see shifts in the mean path or the individual paths, and you may sort of see phase offsets. Now, because you're not expecting these extra sync messages, this monitoring is reasonably conclusive. If you see any of these things are going wrong, then this kind of attack is going on. And then in terms of mitigating that, again, using your boundary clock mode switches is a good way to sort of prevent this. Okay. So in the report, we've identified 17 different threats, so we have threat cards for these 17 different attacks. And we have sort of these mini threat cards, which are looking at sort of vulnerabilities that if you have these vulnerabilities, that your network could be compromised, or it's easy to compromise. So we have 4 of those in the report that we examined. So the next section of the report is looking at what are the best practices as they relate to PTP security. So we want to make sure we protect our management interfaces. So these are both for the GUIs and the APIs. So here your basic IT security recommended practices are very effective. So we want to make sure we're using strong passwords, secure logins, and so on. When you're looking at this, most important to protect our grandmasters and our switches because those affect all the devices in the network. Still important to protect the media nodes, but if you get control of one media node, it's reasonably small in scope what how much damage the person can do. The next recommended practice there's actually 2 things here. One is using boundary clock mode, and this is not from a sort of a PTP design point of view. This is just purely from a security point of view. And then also using the the leader master time transmitter only feature. Actually, there's sort of a typo in the second one because it's missing the word only there. So with boundary clock, basically you're going to terminate the messages from the grandmaster to the switch, and then the switch is going to regenerate those on all the ports. And so this helps sort of prevent, if you've got things like that, bad sync messages. If you're in boundary clock mode, it's going to terminate that, and that's not going to propagate through the rest of the network. There's something which is not in the standard, but most switch vendors implement, which is this sort of leader master time transmitter only mode. Just a quick aside there. In the 1588 standard, it used the terminology master slave, which is not as politically correct. And so in SMPTE, we've sort of discussed that, and we've decided to use the word leader instead of master. The IEEE committee took a little bit longer. They looked at that. They didn't like the word leader either, so they've come up with the word time transmitter. So in SMPTE documentation, you'll see the word leader used, and in some of the newer IEEE documentation, you'll see the word time transmitter used. So what this feature does is, one important thing about our networks is they're an engineered network. We've designed it. There's very specific places where legitimate grandmasters are in the network, and we put those ports into a sort of a leader slave mode, so it can support either. We then have the interfaces which connect to our media nodes. And we know, because this is an engineered network, we never ever want to have those as the grandmaster. So you would want some audio mic to become the time source for your network. And so we basically put those ports, which is most of the ports, in this leader-only mode. And so what that then does is the switch will ignore those ports when it comes to doing the BMC algorithm. So in this case here, some person's added a device which is a rogue grandmaster. They plugged it into the switch, but basically that rogue master will send out announce messages saying, I want to be used in the BMC algorithm, and the switch says, sorry, that port is marked as you can't have a grandmaster on that port, and it ignores it. So you have to sort of look at which ports are directly connected to grandmasters, and which ports here might be connected to another switch, which indirectly connects up to a grandmaster. So you want to label those with the sort of regular mode, and the other interfaces with the leader only, and that way you can sort of control that. Now in the version 2.1 of the standard of 1588, the 2019 version, this was added as an optional feature. So in the 2008, which most of us have implemented, it's not defined in the standard, but most switches have implemented it. The one thing that the boundary clock mode doesn't help protect is management messages. Management messages will sort of flow through the switch, so you still have to be sort of cautious with those. And there's a lot of sort of features in the management messages. Like in the SMPTE profile, we define one, but in general, management messages can be used for things like setting parameters on devices. Say most of us don't use that feature, so you want to sort of try to disable that to take that attack vector away. We want to sort of restrict the use of multicast management messages, because they do flow everywhere. So if you can sort of, you won't have grandmasters on these ports, so you can put sort of ACLs to block those. And we also very specifically want to be careful with the multicast management response messages. So when a device gets a management message, they can do a response. And within the SMPTE profile, we very explicitly said, we encourage you not to respond, and if you do respond, you must respond with a unicast message. So it'll go just back to the grandmaster or to the switch. So that sort of helps prevent that propagation of that. Just a quick little note, if you are using an unpatched version of PTP4L, which some people do, it's not actually SMPTE compliant. So you have to make sure that you get the patched version, which will then not do these multicast responses. You want to protect your GNSS, your Global Navigation Satellite System, which is more a generic term for, say, your GPS or Galileo system. So typically we'll have one antenna sort of to give us some physical diversity, one on the amber side, one on the blue side. You want to be using dual band and multiple constellation antennas, and you want to use ideally antennas which have anti-jamming and anti-spoofing ability. So unless you're in a really, really, really tall building, satellites will be always above you. So the antennas basically say anything from the horizon down is obviously not a legitimate satellite, and they'll sort of attenuate and block those signals. Just a quick clarification. So the GPS signal is very weak, so you can get a GPS jammer, which is basically going to send out RF energy to sort of basically disrupt that GPS signal, and that's basically a form of denial of service. Spoofing is a little more complex. You're basically, instead of just blocking out that frequency, you're basically generating a false signal that looks like a set of satellites, and if you do that, then you can basically look like you're the satellites, and then you can set the time, you can set the frequency. So it's a little more sophisticated form of attack. Just a little note there, I mean, in most countries, owning things like a GPS jammer is illegal. However, unfortunately, the bad actors don't really follow the law, and these are readily available and quite cheap. So I said, like, the anti-jamming antennas will sort of help things from horizon down. You still have the problem that if there's a building taller than you nearby, they can get on top of the building, aim down, and it sort of bypasses that, or put the jammer on a drone or something. One of the other things to sort of note about the jamming and spoofing is that you also have to be careful. It's not always malicious. I heard of a story where there was a power station near near the TV station, and the power industry, they use GPS, they use 1588.2, and so they were doing a test at the power station where they were actually intentionally doing a test where they jammed the power station and to make sure how they would respond. Unfortunately, it had the side effect that it also nuked the TV station nearby, and so it wasn't a malicious attack, it was called accidental, but these kind of things happen. And then we want to be able to sort of monitor to detect the threats going on. So we want to sort of watch out for changes of the system time, or degradation of the time distribution, or sort of denial of service type thing. Now, as Thomas mentioned in his presentation, one problem is that each device enumerates their statuses differently. They call them different names. We have cases where one device would have a control called "I'm locked," and another device would have a control saying "I'm unlocked," so the opposite polarity. And then you have a third device that doesn't even have a lock status at all. And so this makes it harder to monitor. So one thing SMPTE has done to help address that is we've come up with RP 2059-15, which is the Yang data model. And what we've done is we've looked at what are controls that every device and statuses that every device should implement, and then come up with a consistent enumeration so that we all call it "I'm locked," and it's always positive logic. Not everyone implements this, but it's a useful thing if they do. There's stuff on the GitHub, and it's also available on the SMPTE store. For those who aren't aware now, SMPTE sort of recently changed how they do their standards. So if you're a SMPTE member, you can basically log into the SMPTE website and download any of the standards or recommended practices for free. However, I just noticed the other day I went to the website and checked, and there's a mistake, and this one is a paid document, even though it should have that free option, which SMPTE's fixing. So, okay. So just a quick recap on the best practices. We want to make sure we use our IT sort of our IT security best practices, our strong passwords, and so on. We want to use boundary clock modes, and with that, leader, master, time transmitter only feature. We want to restrict the features of the management message to only things that we require. We want to make sure to protect our GNS systems. We want to protect external interfaces, and we want to have that monitoring system. So taking a little peek into the future. So we only went so far with the current document. So some things that we've identified we may want to sort of consider in the future here is using IEEE 802.1x. And what this does is it's a mature technology, and it basically, by default, switch ports are disabled. So if I do plug in that rogue master into my switch, that switch port is effectively disabled. The device has to go through an authentication process, and then if the switch says, yes, you're a legitimate device, I'll then activate that port. So it sort of helps in your switch configuration to sort of prevent when someone plugs into a patch panel and tries to connect to the switch to make sure that they can't get access to important stuff. The newer version of IEEE, the 1588 2019 version, the 2.1, adds some security recommendations. So they're looking at method authentication with TLV and the key management to go with that. External transport message security, so looking at things like IPsec and MACsec, which we don't really use a lot, but it's in the new version there. Network enhancements around how redundant leaders are handled, and adding that monitoring and features. So as we start to sort of deploy the 2.1, which probably will be a while, it's something we want to go back and sort of look at how that impacts our PTP security. So in terms of the report status, that second report is now published. It's available for download. Actually, all the ERs or engineering recommendations are all free. I say, but if you're a SMPTE member, all the standards are free. The simple link is just sort of on the SMPTE technical reports download section, or the link below is kind of the more cryptic, which will take you actually to the PDF. So in summary here, second report is published. It focuses on looking at some more details on the threats, ways to sort of mitigate and avoid them. We define a bunch of best practices, things like using the boundary clock mode. And we have a section that sort of looks into the future. Now, while the report was sort of focused around the media industry, really all these sort of recommendations and stuff apply to any place that PTP is being used. So PTP is used in many different industries, so they can sort of hopefully leverage the work we put down here at SMPTE. One other note is that I've spoken to my PTP expert colleagues in different industries and on the committees. Unfortunately, at this point, there's no real documented cases of someone actually attacking the PTP system. There's lots of documented cases of people doing the GNS jamming and spoofing. That's sort of a well-known problem. But in terms of actually attacking the PTP system so far, there's no cases of that. So that's sort of good for us right now, but also is kind of an opportunity here that we can sort of implement these best practices, harden our systems before this sort of gets to the top of the bad actors' to-do list and sort of attacking our systems. We want to make sure we make our system, our PTP 2059 systems, as secure and as hardened as we can before someone starts to actually go around and start attacking them. Because if you do follow the best practices, which are very straightforward to implement, you can take your system and make it very, very, very secure. Okay, thank you. One just little quick plug here. I am looking for work right now, so if anyone needs help with 2110, PTP, designing products, designing systems, I'm available. There's my contact. I'm here this week. And then I guess with that, if you have any questions on my presentation, open that up.
All right, great. Thank you very much.